Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome again. There are still a few people coming in, but we'll just let them come in as we go through this. Tonight, our presentation is by Nicci Wright of the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital. Nicci is an independent wildlife rehabilitation specialist with over 20 practical years experience. She's director of the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital, which specializes in the treatment and rehabilitation of indigenous wildlife. Having worked with over 350 different species of indigenous birds, mammals, and reptiles, her expertise lies in a range of areas, including rehabilitation, husbandry, wildlife behavior, and release techniques. An integral part of rehabilitation is collecting data and contributing to scientific research, and Nicci enjoys a range of national and international collaborations. She's the lead author of a chapter on the rescue, rehabilitation, and release of pangolins in the book Pangolins, Science, Society, and Conservation, which was recently published by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. With a special interest in otter, honey badger, and pangolin, Nicci is also a member of several IUCN specialist groups and the executive director of African Pangolin Working Group and the wildlife project manager of the Humane Society International. In her wildlife rehabilitation work, Nicci is fortunate to have worked with some incredible species. Her talk tonight will give us a peep into her world and introduces two fascinating species, the European honey buzzard and the African clawless otter. So welcome, Nicci. You can please switch on your camera and I'm handing over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you very much for having me. Just figuring out this screen. Sorry, I'm just figuring out how to get to my presenter view. There we go. Is that right?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Oh, thank goodness for that. Thanks very much, everybody, for your patience. It's always a little nerve-wracking in the beginning until you get going. So we're so fortunate at the Johannesburg Wildlife Vet to have our hands on the most incredible array of wildlife and to be able to see them up close and personal, to examine the birds and animals, you know, and just get a really intimate look at each species. It's quite incredible. We really are extremely fortunate to be able to do this. One of my favorite raptors is the European honey buzzard, and we've been lucky enough to have a few in at the hospital, and also to share a collaboration with a research project, which I'll tell you about. So this young European honey buzzard came to us from the Three Rivers Vet, and it presented with rodenticide poisoning, which is actually quite unusual because although they do eat small mammals, we'd never had one in with rodenticide poisoning before. So it was treated by our vet, Dr. Corinne Lawrence, who's my business partner at the hospital, and she devised a regimen for this bird using, you know, the standard rodenticide poisoning treatment and medication, which involved rehydration fluids, vitamin K to counter and reverse the bleeding caused by the rodenticide, and doing blood profiles to evaluate how well the organs were working or not working. And then the treatment was adjusted each time it needed to be. And initially this bird was extremely weak and couldn't feed itself, and underweight as well, very underweight for its age and size. So it was tube fed with a nutritious and easily digestible liquid diet every few hours, actually, initially. Corinne took the bird home and nursed it through the night. And slowly, the strength improved, the blood coagulated, and the bird was well enough to be feeding itself, and it was put outside into a raptor pen to strengthen and recover. And that's when we were in touch with Caroline Howes, who we knew was doing her PhD on honey buzzards, and said that we had this bird in, and would she like to, you know, get samples from it. and put a telemetry backpack on the bird, which is a solar powered backpack, which when the bird's released will show us exactly where the bird goes to. It's a young bird, and although honey buzzards are summer visitors, they breed in the forested areas of Eastern Europe and Russia, and they migrate across the Mediterranean at its narrowest point into Africa. And of course, there are huge threats for them right there, because you have all sorts of hunters taking pot shots at them, and they come through that area en masse. On the Black Sea, there's an area called Batumi, and some years ago there were 40,000 of these honey buzzards counted in a annual migratory count, which is unbelievable. 40,000 coming through from Europe down into Africa. They feed on wasp nests and larvae and have physical protection for this. They've got quite scaly legs. You'll see a close-up just now of their scaly legs. And they've also got feathers around their eyes that are quite scaly and quite hard, and very slit nares, so or nostrils, to protect them from their prey that could sting and bite them. They also eat small mammals, reptiles, and sometimes other birds. And we know this because we've had a couple of them come into the hospital with trichomonas, which raptors get from eating doves and pigeons. So you can almost imagine these birds, in their secretive ways in the forests throughout Central Africa, as they're moving down, maybe taking the odd dove nestling that might have trich, and presenting with that. And by the time they get down to South Africa, they're already infected with it, and that's why they're picked up. And if lucky ones are brought through to a vet of some sort, and we're able to treat that, and hopefully get them well enough to join the migration back again. So we collected blood and feather samples together with Caroline for her analysis on them. And so each honey buzzard had these samples collected. So she would take the blood for sexing and the feathers for stable isotope analysis. Each bird would be weighed, it would be measured, photographs taken of it. So a full analysis of each bird was taken, which was part of her PhD project, but also just contributes to science, and our understanding of this species, which, until now hasn't been, not much has been known about it. So here in this slide, Dr. Caroline Howes on the left-hand side, a bird ringer, Craig Natras, in the middle, and myself. And we had put a harness onto this bird, which goes around its shoulders and under its body. And in the middle of its back, as you can see just below Craig's hand there, there's a tiny little solar panel. That's the device, the telemetry. So we were checking this harness to check that it was in the correct position and comfortable on the bird. We had a hood on the bird so that it would minimize the stress for the bird. And then we put it into an outside enclosure so that we could monitor the bird for a couple of weeks to see how the harness sat, whether there was any chafing, whether it restricted the bird in any way, and it was actually fine. The solar powered telemetry little backpack weighs 21 grams, which is right for this bird's overall body weight. And in the other picture, you'll see Dr. Corinne and Craig taking measurements just to add to the ringing data. Signal can, of course, be affected by the lack of sunshine because it's a solar-powered unit, and also being out of range in remote areas, as we discovered later on, can affect what's going on with these birds. So Craig, as a licensed bird ringer, applied a SAF ring to the bird and a yellow ID ring. So this bird was number 05. And here you can see the heavily scaled feet and legs, which are the bird's protection. And you can also see in that picture of the bird flying, you can see how quite visible that ID ring is. And that's the bird in its raptor pen. We've put AstroTurf on all our perches, just a good husbandry point, because so that they don't get any bumblefoot from sitting on perches that are too hard. And it continued to do extremely well and feed itself and put on weight. It was really quite impressive the way that it healed itself from that rodenticide after its initial treatment. Male and female European honey buzzards can be separated by their plumage, one of the few birds of prey that can be. The males have a larger gap between the two last bars of their primary feathers on their wings, and they often have a very grey head, quite dove-like almost, in that rounded sort of grey head and that big round eye. The females have got smaller uniform spaces between the bars on their primary feathers and are generally brown in colour. And you get colour morphs that change as the birds age from juvenile to adult. And young birds tend to be completely dark morphs, while most adults tend to be more intermediate, so barred or spotted. So at last release day, we did a very public release, which was a little nerve-wracking. We took the bird to the Walter Sisulu Botanical Gardens. I think it was a Sunday morning, and released her there because it was lovely, thick treed area. And so after 45 days of treatment and rehabilitation, she was released at a weight of 760 grams. Her admittance weight had been 408 grams. So she had done extremely well. And she was released on the 27th of January, 2020. She flew off very, very well. But as you all know, freedom is fraught with challenges. And it's quite a stressful thing being released, because all of a sudden you've got to figure out where you are, where food is, where shelter is. So while freedom is wonderful, it can also be quite stressful. South Africa sees a high number of juvenile and sub-adult birds. About 41.6% of those birds that are photographed are young birds. And of the adult birds photographed in South Africa, 93.3% were female. Records of sightings go back to 1934, and sightings have increased over the last 3 decades. I'm not sure whether that's because more people are birding, and more people are out there with their binoculars. I'm not quite sure why that is. So our bird, as I said, was released on the 26th of January in Gauteng and remained fairly local. She only flew a couple of kilometers away until the 2nd of March. She then flew 900 kilometers to Botswana and returned a little while later on the 13th of March, and she stayed for a month. She then flew north again on the 4th of April and arrived in Captivity, which was 1,230 kilometers on the 11th of the 4th. Her second little trip, after a month in the Captivity, she left on the 16th of May, and she flew about 1,500 kilometers north to the DRC, and arrived 9 days later on the 25th of May. And she stayed there for 115 days. It's been lovely there for a bird like this in the forests. A 300-kilometer flight over 4 days took her to Angola for another 3 months. She seemed to choose to stay in places for 3-month stints. And after 11 days, an 11-day flight, she moved back to the Captivity for 3 months. So she was up and down, backwards and forwards. And that was over the 11 days, a flight of, again, about 1,500 kilometers. She then flew to the Central African Republic. It was a 3-week flight. She flew 3,300 kilometers on the 2nd of March. And that's where she kind of stayed for a while. So this total map, I mean, there were lots of squiggles on all the other maps because she stayed in an area for 3 months and moved up and down and round and round. But this is kind of the general overall picture of where she went from Gauteng all the way up to Central African Republic over months, and spending time in all the nice forested areas and exploring. So generally, I mean, she's an extremely fortunate bird to have been found and saved, you know, from the scourge of rodenticide poisoning, and survived to have done this incredible trip. And because she's a young bird, she didn't have to go back to Russia or Eastern Europe or anywhere else for that matter to breed. So she would have stayed in this area. And that was what Caroline wanted to establish, was whether the young birds actually stay and where they stay. You know, are they in the DRC? They're over Zambia, but this particular bird spent a long time in Central African Republic. So it's been incredible to have watched her journey and gained an insight into the species behavior and movement of these juvenile birds through the application of telemetry. We've so enjoyed these kind of collaborations and you know, on research projects, and we've enjoyed quite a few of them on a variety of species. You know, a rehab facility for wildlife is an ideal place to gather data and information, because all these species are in the hand, and so it's just a very rich environment for gathering data on all these different species. So that's just another shot of our bird. We'd just like to say thanks to everybody involved, and special thanks to Caroline for generously allowing me the use of her maps and other data, which has been fascinating to go through and watch. And then the other species that I wanted to talk about is another favorite of mine, which I've had the honor of working with quite a lot over the years, hand rearing quite a few of them, and also dealing with wild adult otters, which are quite a handful, as you can imagine. So the distribution of Africa's 4 otter species, because we do have 4, that's the map. The mauve color is where the African clawless otter occurs, which is what used to be called the Cape clawless otter. So you can see it's all from the southern tip of Africa all the way through, not the very arid areas, but all the way up through Zim and parts of Zambia, up the eastern seaboard, and across the top of all the you know, forested areas in Central and over to West Africa. And it's just interesting to see how the different species overlap with each other in that on that map. So our African clawless otter is the 3rd largest otter species in the world. It's extremely versatile. You know, it lives in the bush, in the country, along the coast, in urban waterways, coastal and bush systems. I get calls from people from Emmerensha Dam, right in the middle of Johannesburg suburbia, that they've seen an otter. So they make their way in and out of suburbia, and every now and again will pop up somewhere and cause a bit of mayhem and delight. The species has a wide range of prey items that they specialize on, mollusks, fish, insects, frogs, all kinds of things actually. They can be quite opportunistic. They'll take dead birds, they'll take ducklings and that kind of thing, as well as all the things that they shouldn't be taking, which gets them into trouble. Their particular threats are habitat loss and water pollution. They're quite a good indicator for water pollution, although they do tolerate some water pollution, having seen them in areas that are quite polluted in suburbia. They're quite heavily poached and hunted as well. There are various stories that I've heard over the years of farmers having, you know, a shed full of African clawless pelts, for instance, and that kind of thing. In South Africa, they're top species, which is threatened or protected species. And on the IUCN Red Data list, they're near threatened. So that's their distribution and their status. Threats to otters, to adult otters, are they're often injured, they're compromised or trapped. They don't do well near chicken farms or poultry farms or that kind of thing, or where people have water birds on dams. Otters, you know, it's like a McDonald's to an otter, and so they'll go in and take those birds, the same as you know, trout farmers and fishermen also have this constant battle with otter and competition with them. The otter cubs are often separated from the mum, and they're picked up being, you know, injured or weak. They also in their liver, when otters have been post-mortem, you often have high levels of PCB, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which is a highly toxic chemical compound found in their livers, as I say, just through being in polluted waters. In urban areas, they're quite frequently hit by vehicles. And again, their habitat loss, polluted water systems. They are hunted for pelts, as I mentioned earlier, and also for traditional medicine purposes. So those are the threats that face otter. These little cubs are at a very vulnerable age at this sort of stage, as you can see on the slide. They're at the age where they've just started to maybe spruttle around at the edge of the holt. Maybe they've, you know, slid down into the water and got washed downstream. Maybe the mum has taken a long time to come back, and they've started, you know, spruttling around, adventuring, and got lost, and they can't find their way back. Whenever we get a call about an otter cub that's been picked up, we go through fairly exhaustive efforts to try and get them reunited to the mum. And fairly often, well, sometimes we have been successful. There was a case up in the DRC where we had success reuniting a young Conga clawless otter with its mother, which was awesome, because, you know, obviously in the middle of the DRC, they didn't have much in the way of raising things to raise an otter cub with. So it was great that they managed to put her back, and the mother actually watched the mom come and collect the cub again. So if cubs are found, and they are genuine orphans, and attempts to reunite them with the mums have failed, they're often brought through to the Johannesburg Wildlife Vet Hospital to start what's almost a 3-year rehabilitation process. It's a very long process with otters. Same as with honey badgers, just interestingly, and they're related, as you know. So we've had a couple of otters flown in from different parts of the country, because it's a way of getting them up to us very quickly, especially if they're a bit compromised from where they've been. The otter in the photograph at the top came in from the Grahamstown area, and the otter in the picture at the bottom came in from East London, and they were flown in with the battleurs, who've always been extremely helpful with getting animals to us in a hurry. So yeah, we try and get the otters to us as soon as possible. Networking, of course, to get it to specialist care, whether it's us or somebody else who knows otter, to stabilize them and get them stable, as I said, to travel up to us. The sooner the rehabilitation is started, the better for the cub. They're very cute and very playful when they're tiny, and extremely entertaining, but you really don't want a pet otter. There's a huge craze in Asia for small clawed otter being kept as pets. In some countries there it is illegal, but you see the most dreadful videos of them being dressed up, of them being walked on leads, of them in these petting cafes. It's too horrendous for words. And of course, they will end up biting because they'll just become frustrated at some point. And then they probably just get put into a cage. I have quite a few stories of otters that have been kept as pets, and it's all ended in tears. And they've eventually come through, and we've been able to put them into a rehabilitation process, which works when you do it correctly. So hand rearing a specialist species, which is what an otter is a long and very labor intense but extremely rewarding process. And they have a special formula which is unique to this predator. It's not like any of the other predator formulas. Otter cubs are slow developers. They're with their mums for up to 2 years. And when you know them and you see that cub and you understand how they operate and how they behave, you can just imagine them with their mothers in the holt and how that interaction and relationship would be. And you can then understand why they're with their mums for so long. They're extremely tactile. They're always touching and feeling. Those little fingers and hands are going all the time because that's what they use to ultimately find their prey with, feeling under ledges and under rocks and things in streams and dams. And they need that physical contact, the young cubs, and touch. And they will always want to touch you. So they might be on the ground, but they'll have a foot on your foot, or a hand on your hand or your leg. They always want that touch. And so they need that and play, as well as the mental stimulation. They're extremely intelligent animals. They're so crafty sometimes. It's yeah, they have cognitive intelligence, quite similar to a honey badger. So once they've gone from a baby stage, they get moved into an enclosure outside where they are stimulated with small ponds of pools of water, different textures. As I said, they're very, very tactile. So they love to feel things. They love to have floating things in their water, different items. Sometimes you can have different items of different weights that can float in water, or they pull them under the water, let it go, and it'll pop up. And those, I think, are all very good educationally for them, because they're working out mass in water and they're swimming and that kind of thing. Otter cubs don't know how to swim just automatically. They're actually taught by their mums, and I'm sure you've seen videos of mother otters insisting that their babies get into the pool or the river or the dam, and there's a lot of shouting and whistling and squeaking going on, because the otter cubs can't believe that she's asking them to get into that water, but she'll pull them in until they come in, and she'll be right with them, teaching them to swim. And we've done the same thing with many of these little cubs. Yeah, so we often do also hide food items in their water for them to find, put different things at the bottom, little stones, pebbles, bits of bark, all that kind of stuff. And we obviously supervise their swimming at first, because they don't know how to swim properly. And we put into that enclosure different grasses, textured sand and pebbles, because they like to dry themselves on grasses and also on the sand. I'll show you a slide just now of an otter drying itself on sand. They love to rub their chins along this rough sand. I think it stimulates different points or glands or something under their chins. So one of the main jobs of a wildlife rehabilitationist is to stimulate all these babies' instincts, and to get them to understand that they're an otter and they have all these instincts, and that's what makes them an otter. So as I said earlier, they're extremely intelligent. Sometimes they can, it feels like they can outthink you, but they're also quite sneaky. They're known to be unpredictably aggressive, I think is the description in some of these field guides. And they will be, they'll be all sweet and beguiling and alluring, and then suddenly nip you behind the ankle and draw blood, and then just look at you all doughy-eyed again. So they can be quite unpredictable. They can give a nasty bite. I mean, I'm talking properly nasty bite, where they can take chunks out of you as an adult otter. And this can even be when they know you. So, for instance, zoo otter have bitten their keepers that who's hand reared them. So they're big, strong animals when they're fully developed and grown. So as I said, it's an extremely rewarding experience, and you need to be a keen observer and interpreter of behavioral needs and all the developmental stages. And that's what I find so fascinating about my work, is that each species you hand rear, you get to know them so well because you're observing and recording and intuiting what stage they're in and what they actually need. For these young cubs, like this one in the slide, we'll be feeding them natural food items, fish, insects, crab, dead birds. We don't feed them a kitchen diet or a commercial diet at all, because you need them to know to recognize their food, and obviously giving them the item that's appropriate for each development, so that they'll be able to manage scales or bone or feathers. You have to supply them with a holt. You know, an otter's sort of burrow is called a holt. They're extremely deep sleepers as well, these youngsters, or any otters actually. They like to sleep on their back, especially in summer when it's warm, because they've got such incredibly thick fur. I think the count on their fur is like 30,000 hairs per square centimeter, and different layers, so that when they're swimming, their skin actually doesn't get wet at all, which is quite incredible. And that obviously is to their downfall, where they've been so hunted all over the world for their pelts. What else can I tell you? Their whiskers are extremely important. They're a great sensory part of their body, and watching them grow, you'll suddenly see those whiskers grow, and you'll realize that they're ready for the next stage, i.e. deeper swimming, or just the next phase of their growth, their maturity. Their physical development matches the developmental stages that they're going through. So like when you're hand rearing a very small baby and it suddenly starts to get teeth, it's starting to become ready for proper food, and you can start giving it mashed up fish and soft things. And they'll start eating very small fingerling fish quite proficiently. And then you'll start giving them crab, because that's one of their most favorite food. And at a certain age and stage, you'll see how proficient they are at declawing a crab, because that big claw will come up and they will get zapped by that claw once or twice. And then that's the first thing the young cub will go for, is that claw, and they'll take the claw off so they don't get bitten, and then they'll eat the crab. So when they're at the right age, they'll go into a pre-release pen, which is a big pen, mammal-proof pen, which is built in situ to where that otter is going to be finally released. And they go into this pen to acclimatize. So they're getting used to being outside, they're getting used to being in a big wild reserve, and they're getting used to all kinds of things around them. They're getting used to the weather, they're getting used to other animals and scents. The enclosures have to be predator proofed. We provide them with an artificial holt. As you can see, that otter fast asleep in her artificial holt there. And we provide them with a smaller, safer water body for them to use while they're in the pen. Getting used to the neighbors. These are some of the camera traps that have been taken on reserves where we've released otter. And these have been some of the neighbors that have been caught on that camera trap, which is quite interesting and a little scary. But luckily the otters are in a very strong pen, and these were just the sort of territorial animals moving through and having a look at the pen. So the photo on this current slide on the left-hand side is a bit of a blur because the otter's rubbing itself on the sand. So they come out of the water and they look for something to dry themselves on. So it'll be either rough sand or it'll be dry grass that they are going to dry themselves on. Just some of the amazing behaviors that we've watched through doing these otter releases and just being close to the species. I didn't know until a little while ago that otters will eat the tubers of these water lilies, and that's what this one is doing in the middle picture. So that was quite interesting for me. And then just this picture on the right hand side, you'll see those enormous canines. Those aren't the bits to worry about. The bits to worry about are those massive molars at the back of that jaw, and the bite force of the jaw is just frightening. I mean, yeah, they can crunch those huge big crabs just like a poppadom. You'll see the very, very sensitive hands and fingers with a small webbing there holding that fish, not like the other otters, like the spotted-necked otter, which has a bigger webbing. And these fingers are constantly moving. They're constantly feeling, even if the otter is doing something else, it's one hand will be feeling the ground or rocks next to it, constantly moving. And they feel in the mud for snails and worms and little mollusks, and they'll sift it out of the mud and eat those, or they'll feel for crabs underneath ledges in a dam or a river. The Conga clawless otter, which looks quite similar to our African clawless, has a longer middle finger on their hands, which is used for winkling out land snails. So they grab the snail and they use that finger to winkle out the flesh of the land snail, which is quite fascinating. Our otters don't have that, and they also don't really like snails. I've tried, I offer them all sorts of things because I want them to know that all sorts of things are food. So they're not always going to be handed nice, freshly caught tilapia. They need to sometimes eat the odd snail. The otters get taken for daily supervised walks. These are, I'm talking about the cubs that we've raised, to orientate themselves in their new habitat and to start laying down their own territory, and also learning how to swim in deeper water, and in amongst reeds and that kind of thing. It's a whole different ball game from swimming in your nice neat little pond in your pen, and also feeling textures like walking in the mud and all that kind of thing. It's quite fascinating to see them experience all this kind of thing for the first time. And so the release sites are super important because you need to have people on the ground that know what they're doing and understand the behavior, which we've been very fortunate to have. So these two otters are down in Zululand. They've been released into a fantastic waterway and are both doing extremely well almost 2 years later. This is a little video clip of an otter foraging, winkling out things in the mud. It's quietly on its own in the evening. Just nice behavior to watch. Those hands are constantly going underneath the water in that mud, feeling everything. And they'll often look up like that and look around while their hands are working and their fingers are finding things. Another video clip of these two otter, which we were so fortunate to have together, although they're not related. But you can see how incredibly well they play together, and all of those, that behavior is so important for them to develop relationships and develop strength and to develop, you know, self-defense and all those things. There was just a lovely little clip of otters playing. So the release process that we put these young cubs that we've hand raised into is a soft release process, and it's always monitored. So we choose to use camera traps and field signs to do the post-release monitoring of our otter cubs, and a lot of our other species as well, but particularly the otter cubs. You can't put telemetry collars onto otter because they've got short necks, but they've got incredibly loose skin around their neck, kind of like a honey badger as well. So you just can't put a collar on. What they do for telemetry is they put an abdominal implant into the otter, which is a surgical procedure. And we just haven't chosen to do that. Because of our release process, we can watch them very well through camera traps and also field signs. So these are, you know, at a certain age and stage, we'll leave the door slightly ajar of or the gate of their pre-release enclosure, and they'll take themselves off to go and forage on their own, and then put themselves back into their enclosure and sleep in their holt, which is inside the enclosure. And we've seen that time and time again, that at a particular age, they'll start doing this. And that's when we leave the door slightly, or the gate slightly ajar for them. And these are the field signs. This is an Otter Scat on the left. You can see the crushed up pieces of crab shell. Different to a water mongoose who doesn't crush the shell up like that. They leave whole pieces of the crab shell. So you'll see the solid pieces of scat, but you can also see where they've sprainted. And sprainting is like it's almost like a spraying of quite a liquid scat. And they sort of hold their big heavy tail up and do this kind of dance on their back feet as they're spraying this spraint out. And I think that's it's a marking of territory kind of sprainting, whereas this one on the left is just a poop. And then of course their spoor, which you can see here in amongst the birds. An otter, obviously the clawless otter, you don't see the claws, and you can see it quite nicely defined. It's much bigger than water mongoose or a spotted-necked otter. So yeah, those are some of the field signs you'll see of otter. You'll also see flattened grass, and you'll see where they've dried themselves in sand along riverbanks as well. And then the support feeding is so critical of all the hand-reared animals for as long as they want you to support feed or need you to support feed them. So we usually develop a call or a whistle, and we'll give that call or whistle, and then that bird or animal or whatever it is will know that means food. And if they're not doing very well out there, they can come back and they can get lunch or supper or whatever it is. And that's what was happening here with this. Let me just try and get it to work. There we go. This otter coming in for his fish. And some days he wouldn't come back, but other days he would come back, and there it would be. But you'd still go out every day and offer him his fish. And that's, for me, is one of the most critical parts of hand rearing animals, is the support feeding afterwards, and the process of the soft release, because you need to continue that for as long as it's needed. And just this lovely photograph of an otter coming through the water. You know, they look so sleek in the water, and they look so fluffy when they come out of the water and so cute, but they're actually an apex predator, which is quite capable of drowning a big powerful dog, you know, like a bull or a staffy, if they're attacked by dogs. And there've been numerous cases of that actually happening. So this beautiful photograph of a particular otter that I knew just illustrates that. It's lovely, but there's a bit of a a warning of this apex predator coming through the water towards you. And then just a lovely sunset pic of an otter moving through the water. And our thanks to all of you for watching this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks very much to the Honorary Rangers for having me.
Thank you, Nikki. That was wonderful. I think we really enjoyed that. I've got quite a few questions for you, so I'll start. I'll try and keep them to the birds first, and then to the otters. Try and keep them in sequence. A question from Jacqueline. Please explain Bumblefoot.
Okay, Bumblefoot is a condition caused, very common in captive raptors, and it's caused through poor husbandry, or it's actually caused through the bird sitting on an even perch. Because birds, obviously, in the wild will sit on all types of perches. They'll sit on big branches and small branches, and ones that move and that kind of thing. So they you have to give them that kind of perching availability in captivity as well. And the AstroTurf just helps us protect their feet a little bit. What it actually is an inflammation that starts taking place, almost like a bed sore. And it can become really open and inflamed and infected, and you want to prevent that. Yeah.
Okay. A question from Harry about migration of birds. He thought that birds flew from A to B, and that was it. And now you showed him that they sort of move around. I presume that they're busy feeding and sort of doing things like that on their way when they're migrating from one place to the other.
Yes, Harry, I'm not a migration expert, but I'm fascinated by the subject. This was a young bird, so she was exploring, and she wasn't going to go all the way to Russia or Eastern Europe because she didn't have to breed. So she was exploring. But even so, if the adults are moving back to the breeding site, they're not going to do a massive sprint. You know, they'll do a steady flight, I think, but they're not going to do a massive sprint, and they will stop and rest, and they've got to feed, of course, along the way as well.
Okay. A question from me. That are you still tracking that bird, or is the tracking unit stopped working, or where is the bird now? Do you know?
We think the bird. We think the bird now is probably in a similar sort of area, but the tracking device did stop working. And we think it's not because anything's happened to the bird, but because, you know, it's in a heavily forested area. So it's not getting the sunlight that the tracker needs. So hopefully one day there'll be that wonderful ping, and the bird will be back on the radar.
That would be good. Okay. Question from Amy. If honey buzzards are not well enough to rejoin the migration to Europe, do you keep them in captivity for the winter season and wait to release them when the wild population returns in summer?
You can overwinter migratory birds. They don't seem to do very well with it, though. They get quite depressed because it's, you know, keeping them back is going against their body clock for better understanding. And I've seen them get really, really depressed and not do very well. But there have been people who've been successful with it. This depends on the bird, I suppose.
Okay. And then a question from Palisa. Why do you measure the bird's head?
I think when people or bird ringers are ringing the bird, so they put that metal saffring on, which has got a unique number for that particular bird, in case the bird dies or is caught again by somebody, and they can trace back to where the bird has come from. So when they do that process, they measure all kinds of things. They measure the length of the feathers, they measure the length of the tail, they measure the tarsus on the foot, different bones, and they measure the head from the head to the cere or to the end of the beak, and they measure the cere, and they take down all that data, because then you've just got a unique set of measurements for that species and for that bird.
Okay, great, thanks. Sorry, I'm just reading. Okay. Now I think we're into otters. I think I've asked you all the birding questions.
Birdie ones.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Otter. Do otter cubs? This is from Mark Flint. Do otter cubs imprint easily? Is that the major challenge in rehabbing them, and thus the long rehab time?
Hi, Mark. Hope you're well. I think otter cubs do probably imprint quite easily. And it's always a challenge with animals like that, or with honey badgers. You know, those highly intelligent animals, it's always a challenge to try and keep them a little bit at arm's length while you're giving them what they need. So it's always a fine balance. And with ones that have become very imprinted, or ones that have been hand reared by somebody else and they're very, very tame, you have to put them through a slightly different release process, which might take even longer to rewild them, as it were.
Okay. A question from Dominique. I think you've partially answered this. Are there specific things you look for in the behavior of the otters that confirm when they are ready for the next release phase?
Yes. Yeah. So if you know the species, then you'll know what the different behaviors mean. You can interpret the behaviors and know what they mean, because you'll soon discover that if you don't interpret the behavior at the correct time, you'll end up with a very grumpy otter, and then you've got to change something, because that's not very pleasant.
Okay. A question from Felix. You mentioned PCB, a highly toxic oil used in transformers. How are they getting this? How is this oil getting into the water? And thankfully in SA, most transformer oils are now white oils, no longer so toxic. So I presume that's just general pollution that gets that PCB into the water.
I would imagine. I'm not a PCB expert either, but I suppose there's runoff, or there's illegal dumping of stuff. I have no idea how it does, but it obviously does, and it gets into, it's like, I mean, if you look at the livers of orca, whale and things, that's got all sorts of contaminants in. And how does that get into the sea? It's the same thing. People are dumping and leaking, and that's how it's finding its way into the otters' bodies. Yeah. And everything else, of course.
Yes. Okay. A question on Facebook from Jacqueline. At what age do otters reach sexual maturity?
I think it's probably about 3 or 4 years.
Okay. And do you have any idea? This is from Nicolene. Do you have any idea how many otters there are in Kruger Park?
No, I don't.
Does anybody know how many there are in the country?
No, I don't think so. I think the only thing you can do is extrapolate, from how big their territories are. And otters can have huge territories as well. There was a study done some years back in the Eastern Cape, and this one particular male otter had, as part of his territory, 14 kilometers of coastline. I mean, that's huge. That's really enormous. So, who knows how many there are in Kruger? I've got no idea. You'd have to, I don't know, do a study along all the rivers and things.
Okay. There's a question from Jonathan, the famous Scorpion Jonathan Leeming. What can we do what can we do to help urban wildlife?
I think you should answer that question, Jonathan. You're giving me all the tricky ones now. Stop it.
So, another one from Jonathan, which I think we will all like to know the answer to, particularly those of us who've got owl boxes in our gardens. Is there such a thing as an environmentally friendly rodenticide?
I don't believe there is. No, I think poison is poison. And I don't think there's a poison that is environmentally friendly. I just don't believe so.
Okay. A quick response from Jonathan on the chat room. I thought that was an easy question, he says. Okay.
There's so much. I'll try and answer it. There's so much that we can do, Jonathan, as you know, from not using poisons, from encouraging animals, from planting indigenous, to educating yourself, and and just teaching children. I mean, Jonathan himself does a fantastic job at teaching children, you know, on all his courses and his walks and his talks. I'm always so moved when I see his pictures of little kids holding scorpions, and that will move a child for the rest of its life. You know, all it takes is somebody to do something like that with a child, and that will change the course of that kid's thought process and will get them to protect the environment. So I think you're right on track.
Okay. A question from Beverly Elliott. Will an adult female otter adopt an orphan in the wild?
I've got no idea, I'm afraid. Okay. I really don't know. And maybe, you know, you never know what goes on in the wild, and they're so shy. How would you be able to watch something like that? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Okay. Right. From Dominique, is the bite force of these otters known?
I think it is. I just can't remember it.
Okay.
It's a lot. It's a lot. You got to mind your fingers. You don't want your fingers in there.
I did see a question earlier, which I've now forgotten. Somebody asked, are their back feet also webbed?
They are more webbed than their front feet, yes. Yeah, okay. And they do have sort of residual claws on their back feet, but like nails, they're not really claws.
Okay. All right. Jumping back to your falcon. This is from Hippo. Regarding the falcon, how much bigger does he or she get from the juvenile to the adult? The reason he asks is, does the backpack still fit when it grows? In other words, do the straps expand as the bird grows?
No, that bird was probably not going to grow much more than that, and all the careful measuring and keeping the bird for a few weeks after the fitment of the telemetry backpack is all to watch for any kind of problem. So and growing and that kind of thing would have been taken into consideration.
Okay, I think you've partially answered this question from Penny. How big is an otter's territory, and can you release otters near one another? In other words, are they territorial?
They're extremely territorial, yes. And you've got to be very, very careful of that. And that's why we like to put a pre-release enclosure up and camera traps, because one of the things that you're also looking for, apart from the neighbors, as I like to call them, is other otters coming. So if you've put a release pen up and you see spoor of another otter coming, you know that you're probably heading for trouble, because there's going to be a territorial otter coming to investigate the interlopers, and yeah, you don't want that, because they're so incredibly powerful that it would end up in a big territorial issue, in a big territorial fight.
Okay, Marty Jasper, I'm not quite sure what he means by his first question. He says, were the cubs all born in captivity while the mother was being rehabilitated?
No, none of them were born in captivity. They were all born in the wild, and they were true orphans. We had tried to reunite them with the mothers, and that had been unsuccessful. So they were all wild-born otter cubs. Okay,
and then another part of his question, you answered how old they need to be to breed. Do you have an idea of how long they live in the wild?
I would imagine it's probably, if they don't get eaten by like a crocodile, which I think, or a python, I think those are probably their two main predators, because they don't have that many predators, being an apex predator themselves. But I would imagine that if they were fairly successful, maybe 8 to 10 years in the wild.
And then Marty's last question, you mentioned finding them in Emerentia. Do you think they would ever become resident there?
I think Emerentia Dam probably is part of an urban otter's territory. You know, there are spraits all the way through Johannesburg that link up to different little dams, and I think they move along these little spraits and through the dams, much to the horror of the local fishermen. But and that's usually when we get to hear that there's an otter, you know, in one of these dams, is by the outcry of the fishermen.
Okay. From Llewellyn, would the rodenticide poisoning not possibly have affected the bird's ability to take a migration flight? compared to, say, that of a bird that was not affected?
No, because the bird had been completely cured after the treatment, the veterinary treatment from the rodenticide toxicity. I mean, no, I don't think that at all. I think the bird didn't do a full migration because she was a young bird and she wasn't going to breed. So she doesn't need to fly all the way to Russia when she can have a lovely time in the forest in the Conga, you know. So I think that's the reason, not because she had rodenticide poison.
Okay. What are the factors? So this is from Amy. What are the factors that help you decide on the suitability of a waterway when deciding where to release them?
There's several factors, Amy. One is whether there have been resident otters sighted there and how often. Another one is to have a good team on the ground. So that's absolutely critical because it is very time consuming and it's a daily, daily work involved. So I think those are the two main things, and also that the waterways have enough food. So you have to do a sort of census of what food is available.
Okay. All right, I think you've explained, this is a question from the net, you've explained the first bit about soft release areas and territories. How many soft release clinics are there in South Africa? She says, I think she means how many other people are doing the same sort of work that you are.
I'm sure there are other wildlife rehabilitation facilities all through South Africa. Okay.
Sorry, I'm just crossing over to questions on that came from Facebook. If you find a cub, how would you know that it's been separated from its mother?
Well, a cub that is as young as those two little ones that were in that one slide, those shouldn't be out on their own. They shouldn't be out of the holt. So if you find something that young wandering around, and it would be calling, they do a high-pitched whistle when they call for their mums. That's not normal. That's not right. So that needs to have some sort of intervention.
Okay. One thing, a question from Richard Roundtree. Do otter males kill cubs when taking over a territory?
I don't know.
Okay. There's obviously somebody needs to do a lot more research on otters so that we learn all these things.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very good question. I'm sure there are other otter experts out there that do know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question from John Friedman. Here in the Cape, we often witness interactions between otters and humans in the wild along our coast, mostly initiated by the otters themselves. Is an otter approaching humans in the wild a territorial behavior, fearlessness, or just basic curiosity?
I think when you've got otters in those situations, and I know a couple of those places along the Cape, in the Cape, where this sort of interaction is taking place, I think the otters, they're urban otters, so they're habituated to people. They know people's sound and smell, and they see people all the time from the waterways. And I think it's probably curiosity when they approach them. But I have seen some very disturbing videos of people standing with their little children and otters coming out of the reeds. The otters have been intrigued by the dogs that people have had with them. But I mean, those otters, if they put their head up, are sort of eye level to these little children. And that's just a disaster. I've been horrified at watching that kind of interaction go on. I would never do it. I mean, I just think it's waiting for something to happen. And then, of course, what will have to happen is that, or not what will have to happen, but what probably will happen is the otter will be trapped or shot or taken away or, persecuted because of that. And it's actually people encouraging that behavior. It's like feeding wildlife, that kind of thing.
Okay, here's one from Leanne. Not a question. It's been amazing to see the otter from East London area grow and be released. I saw that otter before we sent it to you. Amazing work. Thank you.
Yeah, Thanks, Leanne.
Okay. Right. Another one from John Friedman down in the Cape. We have a resident population of otters alongside the African penguin colony at the Boulders. We've never seen an otter take a penguin egg or chicks. Would these naturally form part of their diet?
I would have thought that possibly they would have, but also, I mean, you would know what a penguin's beak is like. So maybe penguins are able to defend themselves against otters or defend their eggs. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Penguins are quite ferocious themselves, so maybe that's got something to do with them.
They can certainly peck quite hard. I can vouch for that.
Yes, me too.
All right. A question from Duan. Do you know how many cubs a female otter may have in her life?
I'm not sure about in her entire life. I know that they probably have about 2 at a time. I know some books talk about up to 5, but not for the African clawless, I don't think. So if you think she lives for 10 years and maybe she breeds every 2 years, that's going to be 5 sets of 2. So it'll be 10 cubs in her lifetime.
Okay.
Approximately.
All right. One from Ashraf, which you've basically answered, which was, do otters have any form of vocalization? So you have,
Yes.
you have answered that.
Yeah, they have a whole range of vocalizations, from growling to squealing to a sort of huffing that they make, which is a warning sound. It's also an encouragement sound when they want food, and they have a very high-pitched whistle that they use when they're calling a cub or calling a mother.
Okay. One from, we're going back to the honey buzzard now, from Alexander. Can you briefly explain the stable isotope analysis done on the feathers of the honey buzzard?
It's got to do, my understanding, and I'm not the scientist here, but it's got to do with finding out where the bird has flown, as far as I know. So I know they can test for heavy metals in the feathers. They can test for certain types, I think pollens and all those things that stick to the feathers or get embedded into the feather. I know some years ago we did a lot of work on a roost collapse of Amur falcons and lesser kestrels that happened in Ventersdorp, nogal, and so they did a lot of those feather testings to find out which heavy metals those feathers contained, to find out which migratory route those birds took. So they work out which factories they're flying over, which industrial areas they're flying over, and match it to what's been found in the feather. So that's one of the things I think can be done with the stable isotopes. So it's not a very scientific answer, I'm afraid, but I'm not the isotope specialist.
Okay. One from Lynn Jones, which you've basically answered. We had an otter couple on the beach at Brenton-on-Sea, very close to people. Is this normal? I think you've answered that. And I can just say, I remember once being down in Hermanus and walking along the beach, and where the little streams come in, you often see otters, and as you walk by, they pop up their head and they swim towards you. So they're obviously curious and wanting to see who or what you are. So now I'm going to thank you for this. I think that we've done all the questions. I'll send you the Zoom file with all the questions in. So if there are any there which need a little bit more detail, one which I've sort of I missed from, I think it was on Facebook. Somebody wanted to know if you need volunteers to help you. So if you need, I know you said you need experienced people. So, but I'll send you the file, and you can then answer people and tell people how they can get hold of you if you do need volunteers. I'm sure there are people, but I think that people need to understand that it's quite a commitment to volunteer for this type of thing. So.
Yeah, it certainly is. I would say that if anybody is interested, they can follow our Facebook page, which is a very active Facebook page. So you get a nice peep into all the cases that we work with and what's going on. But you can also find our email address there and email us if you've got any queries or thoughts.
Okay, yeah. I'll send it to you. And then one final question from Marty, which I think you've opened yourself up to now. When are you going to give us a talk on honey badgers and rattles and pangolins.
I'd love to. I'd love to.
I'll leave that up to Norma to negotiate that one with you.
With pleasure.
Right.
With pleasure. Yeah.
So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I think that everybody learned a lot. It's one of those things where they look very cute in pictures, but obviously not so cute when you've actually got to look after them and keep your fingers out of the way. So
Yes.
from all of us, from everybody that watched, there were a lot of people watching. Thank you from the Honorary Rangers for your time and for giving us this talk. And thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. And just a quick couple of things from us. On the 31st of July, we're doing a webinar for World Ranger Day, which will be a pre-recorded talk with various rangers from various parks around the country, some of whom you know, Richard Sowry, Owen Govender from Neisner, Philip Prince from Cape Town. So that will be live on Facebook and on Zoom. We are all their Honorary Ranger members will get a direct invite. Other people, there is a link on our Facebook page that you can click to get an invite. So that's our next big job that we're tackling. And then a thank you to Nikki and to everybody who joined us, for the team behind the scenes who helped with all the questions and sorted all that stuff out. For those of you that don't know about the Honorary Rangers, please go to our website and have a look. You'll find information about all the things that we do. And you'll see there that we are a bunch of volunteers. There are a lot of volunteers in a lot of places in South Africa who do a lot for conservation. We're one of those groups. So we're always trying to raise money to help sandparks with equipment, with all sorts of things that they need. I'm sure Nikki can tell you how expensive some of these things are to keep track of, and certainly those tracking devices on the honey buzzard are not the cheapest things to find and put on things. So we do appreciate any donations that we can get. As Nikki said, please go to her Facebook page and see what's going on. We have a Facebook page as well, which you can go to, and we have the website. So once again, thank you all. Thank you for joining us all. We will send out notices for our next webinar early in September. I have to be honest, I've totally forgotten what the subject is because I'm so involved with trying to do the World Ranger Day. But anyway, from me, enough talking. Nikki, once again, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Have a good evening, and please, everybody, stay safe. Thank you and good night.
Right.